Good evening, Tanse, and welcome to APTN National News. I'm Daryl Stranger. We begin tonight in Ottawa, where Prime Minister Justin Trudeau spoke to Fraser Needham at Ottawa's National Day of Truth and Reconciliation event at LeBreton Flats on Friday. Here is some of that interview.
I just want to say thanks very much for joining us here today on, I guess, the second official National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. Now, last year, of course, was the first one, and you did make the decision, I guess, to spend sort of a vacation day with your family and sort of miss that invitation from Kamloops. Did you have any regrets about that, and maybe wanted to do things a little differently this year?
Oh, of course. I mean, last year we got to do a ceremony on Parliament Hill the night before, and that was the big event in Ottawa. But absolutely, I wish I'd been in Kamloops for that. It was a really important time. I did go a few weeks later and meet with survivors, as I've continued to meet with people throughout the year. But today was a really, really important moment to reflect on the kids we lost, kids' families lost, survivors. Reflect on the ongoing impact of residential schools, and also try and look towards the future with hope as we remember, as we commemorate, and as we heal.
Right, now you've been Prime Minister just coming up on 7 years now. How time flies, right? And I remember that campaign in 2015, seeing you in Saskatoon, and how much you had pledged to reconciliation and how much you made Indigenous people part of that campaign. It's obviously really dear to your heart. However, you become Prime Minister and there's so many issues. Things move slower in government. I guess in terms of that, do you feel a frustration that on some of these files, MMIWG or whether it be unmarked rapes, things like that we're not further ahead, and that also, do you have some, you wish you were at a difference, wish you were a bit further ahead on these issues?
I am hugely impatient to do even more. I think the speed of reconciliation is something that we were always going to have to contend with. It is, as Marie Sinclair pointed out today, what took generations to break in terms of relationships and in terms of community is going to take generations to heal. But there are things that we can and have been moving very quickly on, but there's always more to do, and that's why making sure that as we build capacity, as we help communities come along and figure out what their needs are and respond to those and put them at the center of everything we're doing, which took a while to get ramped up. The pace of change is accelerating, and it's going to continue to.
For every Canadian that we have that will accept non-Indigenous Canadian that will accept responsibility for what's happened in the past and history, there'll be another that resists it and actually becomes angry and refuses to acknowledge some of what happened in residential schools, for example. Now, you're the Prime Minister for the whole country. Now, how do you bring people together on these issues that your government's moving forward, but make sure all Canadians feel part of the process?
Well, the first thing is to understand where people are coming from. While residential schools were busy trying to attempting to teach Indigenous kids that they had no value, that their languages had no value, that their culture, that their identity had no value, every other school in this country was teaching a version of that to non-Indigenous kids. So our communities, our institutions, and many citizens were raised with that mindset, still part of their present, that Indigenous culture, that Indigenous languages, Indigenous identity is somehow worth less than the culture that we have as Canada. And that's wrong. But when people have been taught that all their lives, it takes time to bring them along. And we're seeing every year more and more Canadians stepping up to be part of that path of reconciliation.
Again, to your passion about Indigenous issues, reconciliation, where did this come from? Was it somewhere you lived and taught, or was it from your father, or where did you get such a passion? Because your government has made it a priority.
When I was a kid, my father brought me a number of times to the Arctic to meet with Inuit elders. He brought me across the country to meet with chiefs, and while he was visiting extraordinary corners of the country, I got to tag along. I got to see the amount of hard work that was there to do and that he cared deeply about. And it was only much later when I would get into politics that I realized all the work my father had left unfinished on that. That for all the progress he had made in the 80s, which seemed significant, there was so little actually done that it's the continued work to make sure that Canada is the country we all want it to be.
Catholic bishops from across Canada reunited in person for the first time in years to discuss, among many topics, reconciliation. The Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops, or CCCB, gave updates on their fundraising efforts, giving land back, and more. Amelia Fournier attended their press conference in Cornwall, Ontario.
The press conference opened with a land acknowledgement.
Before we begin, we acknowledge that Alexandria, Cornwall is located on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Mohawk, Huron-Wendat.
In a press release following the plenary assembly, the CCCB also said that Canada's bishops continue to, quote, reject and resist ideas associated with the doctrine of discovery in the strongest way possible, end quote. Despite this, Bishop McGrattan said that returning church land to affected First Nations would be a complicated decision.
Part of what I know that bishops are doing is entering into these discussions with communities to understand some of the history of these land agreements, to understand the history of the presence of the Catholic Church in those communities, whether that be through a residential school or a parish. And I think at this point, as I've entered into discussions locally, I'm starting to see the complexity of this question.
Last year, the Catholic Church said they'd raise $30 million for healing and reconciliation over the next 5 years through the Indigenous Reconciliation Fund. So far, they've raised $5.5 million. In comparison, the Canadian Catholic Church spent $18.6 million total on the 2022 papal visit. When asked why funds for reconciliation couldn't be made available sooner, Bishop McGrattan said it was to strengthen relations between local dioceses and Indigenous peoples.
One of the decisions is to allow for that to be collected over 5 years, is to make sure that the local relationships, the ability for the local communities to identify the needs that will be most important and impactful.
The bishops also approved guidelines for diocese archivists so that researchers and those affected by residential schools alike could access records easier.
I think we are trying to take to heart what Pope Francis invited us all to do, is to make concrete what reconciliation is, and always to do it in a sensitive way.
Amelia Fournier, APTN National News, Montreal.
It's been 2 years since the death of Joyce Echaquan. In her final moments, the 37-year-old Atikamekw woman live-streamed staff at a hospital in Joliet, Quebec, insulting her. Her family is still asking the Quebec government to recognize systemic racism in the province, and they're hoping a civil lawsuit will bring the issue to the forefront. Tom Fenario and Shushan Bécan have the story.
Purple was Joyce Echaquan's favorite color, and on the anniversary of her death, it becomes the favorite color of her community of Manawan First Nation. Wednesday, people here took to the streets to remember that 2 years have passed. 2 years since Echaquan live-streamed hospital staff hurling insults at her shortly before her death. Echaquan's spouse, Carol Dubé, still struggles with the memory of her final moments.
Quand j'ai vu la femme que j'aime, quand elle a crié dans nos cœurs, vous étiez là. Et aujourd'hui encore, vous êtes autour. Cela nous donne la force de continuer.
For the people that Echaquan left behind, moving forward doesn't just mean commemorative events like this. Her family is also taking it to the courts. Thursday, they filed a $2.7 million civil lawsuit against the regional public health authority that runs the hospital where Echaquan died. A doctor and nurse were also named in the lawsuit. The statement of claims says Echaquan was denied her fundamental rights, and the obligations owed to her by the defendants were violated in a context of systemic racism and unsafe health care.
When we talk about systemic racism, we're not just pulling that from out of nowhere.
At a Montreal press conference, Atikamekw leaders and a lawyer for Joyce Echaquan's family explained the reasoning for the suit. They all say it's not just about money.
Hopefully that this lawsuit will make things move further, faster as well.
A key argument in the lawsuit is that Joyce Echaquan is not an isolated incident.
Alors bonjour.
2 years before Echaquan's death, the Vienne Commission into the Treatment of Indigenous Peoples in Quebec Public Services heard testimony of 20 instances of racism at the Joliette Hospital towards Atikamekw people.
When the death of Joyce Echaquan happened, we realized that nothing was done. No concrete gestures were made to address this situation.
Premier François Legault continues to maintain that in Quebec, systemic racism does not exist. During a recent debate, Legault said the issues at Joliette Hospital were resolved. He later apologized directly to Carl Dubé, saying he didn't mean to offend him. For Dubé, the discussion on systemic racism comes down to this.
Les choses qui auraient dû changer n'ont pas été changées. Puis on attend encore.
The Public Health Agency of Lanaudière says they will not be commenting on the lawsuit, and while no money can bring back Joyce Echaquan, her family hopes it will force others to take notice. Tom Fenario, APTN National News, Montreal.
It's time for a short break. Stay with us. More news coming up. Welcome back. The first Mi'kmaq person to enter the Catholic order and become a nun is also a residential school survivor. Angel Moore brings us this story of Sister Dorothy Moore.
Sister Dorothy Moore says people always ask, how could you become a nun?
How could you ever think of becoming one of those people that punished you so much? That one of those people whose intent was to change you from.
Moore, 89 years old, of the Member 2 First Nation, was taken to the Shubenacadie Indian Residential School when she was 10 years old and punished on the first day of class for not understanding English.
It wasn't my language, and yet I was expected to understand. I was expected to understand what I was being told. And because I didn't understand what I was being told, I was being punished.
It was the only residential school in the Maritimes where about 1,000 Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqiyik children were taken. Moore recalls the impact of that first day.
I was terrified. I was terrified. I was terrified of this teacher. And I just had no way of understanding what I can do to make a difference for me.
Moore says the children worked half days, laundry, cleaning, or cooking, but she was sent back to the classroom.
And I put the wrong number down, and I get a whack in the head with a pointer. And this continued for at least a good hour, if not more. I mean, in my memory, it just says it was an afternoon of punishment. So much so that I could no longer comb my hair.
Managed by the Archdiocese of Halifax, the Missionary Oblates of Mary Immaculate, and staffed by the Sisters of Charity of St. Vincent de Paul, the school operated from 1930 to 1967. Moore says it was genocide.
It was very inhumane way of treating a child.
After the residential school, Moore attended the school in the Eskazoni First Nation, where the Sisters of St. Martha taught. Moore says the nuns behaved differently there.
These sisters were talking to us. These sisters were laughing with us. These sisters were walking with us. These sisters were encouraging us to do something for yourself.
Inspired, Moore decided to become a Sister of St. Martha.
I want to be one of those. I want to be one of those sisters. I want to be a sister to work with my own people. My own people.
Moore continued school, became a teacher, and reformed the Nova Scotia education system to include Indigenous culture and language, reviving what the residential school tried to destroy.
I was determined I was not going to be held hostage. That I was not going to be held hostage by them.
Moore is still teaching. She wrote a book called A Journey of Love and Hope to share her story with others. Angel Moore, APTN National News, Antigonish, Nova Scotia.
Two important historical figures of the residential school era are the focus of a new short film. It was put together by the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society and an Ottawa cemetery. APTN's Fraser Needham has more.
After inspection, Bryce stated in a published report that 24% of the pupils who had been in the schools are now known to be dead.
The film focuses on Duncan Campbell Scott and Dr. Peter Bryce. Scott was a top official with what was then called the Department of Indian Affairs in the early 20th century. He was a strong proponent of assimilation and the residential school system itself. Dr. Peter Bryce was the chief medical officer for the department at the same time. He spoke out strongly against the unhealthy conditions at residential schools. Both are buried in Ottawa's Beechwood Cemetery. And Beechwood Director of Communications Nick McCarthy says it's important the cemetery reflect the true and most up-to-date history of the two men.
Because history was always written by those who vanquished the other people. So in this case, we're having Indigenous voices and we're having people really talk about Indigenous issues from an Indigenous point of view. So it's very, very important. And we're seeing that more and more, that people are being more receptive.
Erica Wagner is the programming coordinator for the Beechwood Cemetery Foundation, and she put together the video that accompanies the radio program based on a 1978 CBC production. It's a reenactment of the writings of Bryce and Scott. Wagner says it was an eye-opening experience.
It was just shocking, horrifying that all this information about the schools and the statistics were there so early. Like in 1907, he put the first document out to Duncan Campbell Scott, and the reason that he didn't try to fix anything was money.
Jennifer King of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society says because of Bryce's writings, Canadians were fully aware of what was going on in residential schools more than 100 years ago.
He was one of the early, if not first, whistleblowers of the residential school system. And from his story, we learn that people of the time did know better. And I think that's something that Canadians in general are still reckoning with.
And I think it's the message is that there's always people that are going to advocate, and you need to listen to those people to right the wrongs so that we don't do the same mistakes.
Fraser Needham, APTN National News, Ottawa.
All right, it's time for one final break. Still to come, a goodbye message for someone very special to us. Welcome back. It's time now for our photo of the day. This was sent in by Kenneth O'Keefe. These are the totems that can be seen in Stanley Park, located in Vancouver, British Columbia. Kenneth was there just last week. Thanks for sending those in. We want to see your pictures, so send them by email to share@aptn.ca. Now let's take a look at tomorrow's weather forecast. We start over in the east, 16 in Sun and Charlottetown and 14 in St. John's. 18 degrees in Cartwright and 19 in Happy Valley Goose Bay. 16 degrees in Quebec City and 18 in Montreal. 21 and clear in Toronto and 19 in North Bay. 18 and some showers in Timmins and 19 in showers in Sioux Lookout. 9 degrees and clear in Churchill and 11 degrees in Puckawagan. 17 in Barons River and 20 in Winnipeg. 27 in Swift Current and 21 in North Battleford. 15 degrees in Buffalo Narrows and 8 degrees in Stony Rapids. Moving west, 12 degrees in Fort Chipewyan and 16 in Fort McMurray. 22 in Edmonton and 23 in Calgary. 15 degrees in Tofino and 21 in Campbell River. 15 in Sandspit and 11 in Dease Lake. 10 degrees in Beaver Creek and 2 degrees in Rock River. 6 degrees in Norman Wells and 3 in Yellowknife. 1 degree in Fort McPherson and 2 degrees in Inuvik. -7 in Cambridge Bay and +1 in Baker Lake. 3 degrees in Iqaluit and -2 in Clyde River. A Métis artist in Winnipeg has spent the past year making over 200 clay bowls in memory of the women in her family. On Thursday, Tracy Charette Fair held an event to gift late last week ahead of the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. Those who attended were able to choose a bowl in honor of a woman in their family. The names of those women were written and will be part of a future project. Charette Fair says the bowls symbolize holders of water and life, much like the matriarchs of all Indigenous nations.
There's 250 bowls, and they represent 250 years of Métis women on in my mother's lineage. I wanted to honor the matriarchs, the women in the family, because a lot of the Métis histories is based on sort of the men, a lot of the battles, and women kind of often were not as visible and sometimes weren't even named. So I wanted to recognize the women because to me the women are the backbone of the nation.
A fond farewell for us here at APTN as we said goodbye to host producer Melissa Ridgen just before the weekend. She worked at APTN News for 13 years. Melissa started at APTN Investigates in 2009 and broke a number of stories, including her first one about how Indigenous people vote. She moved on to shaky housing on Sandy Bay First Nation and covered temporary labor in Hurting for Work. She won a Canadian Association of Journalists Award for that one. 4 years ago, Melissa came over to the news side and started hosting the national news and APTN in Focus. She tackled the child welfare system, MMIWG, and even some fun things like pizza. We will certainly miss her on the news desk, but not as much as she will miss you.
I love you guys. You really are the best audience. I can't get into it too much or I'll start crying, but APTN has the most incredible audience. Thank you for being with me for 13 years and tuning in and sending me your stories and your feedback, and you will be missed.
And I know all of us here at APTN are certainly going to miss Melissa, and we wish her nothing but the best going forward. All right, that's all we have for you for this Monday edition of APTN National News. I'm Daryl Stranger. Thank you for joining us. Miigwech, and have a great night.